Hello and welcome back. This is Rise of Europe for Lee University with Dr. Schlosser. And today we're going to be looking at cities in the Central Middle Ages. Up until this point, through the Middle Ages, cities had largely shrunk in the West. It's not that you didn't have cities, they were just on a much smaller scale than they'd been in the Roman period. So it's during this period in the Central Middle Ages, sometime around the 900s, the 10th century, that cities are going to really start growing again for some of the reasons that we've already talked about with other things going on here in the Central Middle Ages. We talked about second wave invasions settling down with the Magyars and the Vikings, and as those people settled down, you have an increase in networks to other areas of the world beyond Europe. And there's also this agricultural revolution that we've been talking about, where now people are growing more food, they're growing better food. And as there's more food available, people aren't just living in subsistence farming where they're growing enough food year after year just for that singular year, but now there's stockpiles of food. Enough maybe that you could even sell some for a profit. And if there are people selling food for a profit, that means there are people buying food. And if they don't have to grow their own food, they can spend their time pursuing other livelihoods, like trades and crafts, and selling their goods in other places. And so you get the development of these things called great fairs outside of these growing cities, maybe not too far of a ride, but enough to sort of separate yourself from the cities. And these great fairs would gather around some of the larger growing urban centers in Europe. And as these merchants are traveling to different places, they need the money to fund that. Traveling is not cheap. And so the money has to come from somewhere. And you'll see a growth in banking, lending money for interest, coming out of particularly northern Italy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So as these towns grow, and as you get a growing group of people who no longer have to have to grow their own food, but now can rather buy it with profits from other endeavors, you have a growing group of people in society that's a merchant class. And we call these people burghers and burgesses. Burghers are the men, burgesses are the women participating in this. And you do have both. This is an increasingly wealthy and powerful group of people within towns. This is something different than what we've seen up until this point. Traditionally, access to wealth and access to power came through owning land. And the merchants don't necessarily own land. They may have a house in town, but it's not a large estate. Their money rather comes from the goods that they make, the services they provide, and the profits that they can make from buying and selling those things. And so as you get different merchants from different areas selling their particular goods, different areas are known for specializing in whatever their region does best. So, for example, we mentioned in northern Italy, this is where often banking happens and lending money for interest. In the Low Countries, that's modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands, the Flemish areas will be known for their textiles. France is known for their wine and their cheese. England is known for their wool, and this sort of thing. And so if you want the best, say, for example, wool, you would know to buy from an English merchant. If you wanted a good piece of clothing, you would buy from a Flemish merchant, and so on and so forth. And so you get a development of long-distance trade networks in a much more complicated way than we've seen in the early Middle Ages. It's not that long-distance trade died out in the early Middle Ages. It just wasn't quite as diverse and overarching as we see here on this map. And you can see traveling merchant lines going overland through the continent of Europe, but also by sea through the Mediterranean, through the North Sea, around through the Atlantic from the English Channel down around Spain and Iberia and down into the Mediterranean. So there are lots of access to different areas, different goods, different regions that are specializing in different things in ways that we hadn't seen in the past. And so these cities grow. We get urban economic centers in ways that we haven't seen in the past. And this is a picture of the city of York in England. York is a good example of a medieval city. You can see the cathedral in the background. It's still standing. Part of the medieval wall still stands. You can walk along it. There's the medieval quarter. You can walk along the medieval cobblestone streets. Those aspects of the medieval city are still there in a place like York. You can still see them. And it's a good example of how these cities grow during this period. And the cathedral is a good example of central medieval architecture, and we'll talk more about that at another time. But cities are complicated places. And within this growing network of economies, there are complicated roles that different people play, and Jews are a good example of this. Jews occupy a very in-between space in the medieval economy. They're important. Often it's the Jews who are involved in this financial, commercial lending of money. They're necessary in a lot of cases for this economic growth to happen. But the Jews are also different than a lot of the medieval Christian European communities. They're seen as different religiously. They have different social and cultural practices. And so in a lot of ways they're excluded, they're marginalized, they're left out, sometimes even forcibly expelled from communities for being different. Cities are often sectioned by trade. These merchants who are selling different goods will often group together with like-minded and like-practicing other merchants. So, for example, bakers will all gather together with other bakers, blacksmiths with other blacksmiths, weavers with weavers, and so on and so forth. What often happens, though, then, is not just a sectioning off of the cities, but also a stratification. So some areas are more desirable based on the craft. So the examples that I always use are baking and leather making, or the practice of tanning. Imagine baking or walking into a bakery in the early morning when the bread is coming out of the oven, the smell of fresh bread, the smell of the yeast. It's a desirable atmosphere. It's a place where you'd want to be. You wouldn't mind. Maybe you would even want to live close to the bakers, let's say. But tanning is a notoriously stinky and messy and dirty trade. And while perhaps we all like our leather goods, it might not be as desirable to live close to where those goods are made. So as these people are living together, living close by each other, interacting with each other, eating meals together, going to church together, they'll form organizations called guilds to sort of standardize their trades. Now these are primarily economic organizations. You would learn your craft, blacksmithing, let's say, through a guild. You'd start as an apprentice and move up as a journeyman and then finally as a master. But again, these are like-minded people who you are working with every day, you're eating meals with, you're going to church with, you're celebrating holidays with. And so guilds become not just economic organizations, but also social and religious organizations. And so cities are vibrant, growing places in the central medieval society. Economies take off during this time, but are sometimes quite complicated. We'll leave it there for now, and we will continue on in the next video talking about central medieval culture.